to cloud. So if you look at the participants, you should be able to see that this session is going to be recorded. So I'm going to call off my kids, and then I'm going to get, what's his name, Itu to call off his kids. Do Kifli, first speaker, opposition. Can you please make yourself known?
Yeah. Hi, that's me.
All right, great. And then Nadia, second speaker, opposition. Can you please make yourself known?
Hello.
Hi. Okay, great. And then Saloha, last speaker, opposition. Can you make yourself known?
Yeah.
Aloha.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Barely. Okay, great. We can hear you now. Itu?
Okay. Today, first speaker up.
Yes.
Are you there today?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, lovely. And then Farai, second speaker opposition.
Yeah, that's me.
Okay, lovely. Proposition, sorry. And then Ande, third speaker proposition. Okay. Please, can you just test your mic, Ande? Just test your mic. Just unmute yourself. Let me hear.
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Okay, you can put it back on. Thank you so much. Okay. Okay. Okay, guys. Like Coach Dominic has already stated that the purpose of today's debate, right, is just I think to see if you know how you guys are as debaters, and generally it's a match to I think just to one, that you learn from one another, but two, to analyze and see. Just a second. Hello. Askisi. Okay. Guys, give me 1 minute, please, okay? Like, insurance people are here. Just a sec.
Okay, so clearly Coach Itu is going through a little bit of drama. I just want to continue through some of the points that he had raised. Today's session is not meant as a competitive session of like bragging rights or anything like that. So you are not even allowed to even brag about a win or a loss, or be disappointed about a loss after this. The whole point of this is to really just build your ability to argue in the position that you have been given. You're going to be evaluated based on the position that you've been given. So really, really important. I just wanted to hold the fort while you were away, Itu, so I'm going to leave it.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And also what I was just about to say, and I think, thank you, you've actually touched on what I also wanted to say, that part of the reason this is also being recorded is, I think more specifically also for me, is that because I coach both teams, I need, over this weekend to go over this debate, and I think just take some notes on all 6 of you, and just give you comprehensive feedback in next week's coaching sessions. Dom, I'll also be able to see the teams next week. Am I correct? The national team next week, because I'd also like to give a sort of feedback session in that regard as well. So at the end of of all of this, we'll ask you guys to give your own commentary, and then you'll only get our commentary next week. Since we're going into the weekend, because I'm going to want to have like an overview of what this debate is going to look like. Thank you very much. Over to Shade. Let's hear you. Thank you very much. Prop 1. Speeches are 8 minutes. Hey, can somebody do the time? Sorry, let me see. Time.
Hi, Itu. Is it possible for you to on an online timer where you can
Okay.
just share screen on, yeah?
Okay, and then what do I do? Then I share my screen.
Yes, you share screen on that online timer.
Okay. Okay,
Since you're
timer.
admin,
Stopwatch. Stopwatch. Uh-huh.
yeah, there are so many free stopwatches online that you can just find.
Thank you
Yeah.
so much. Thank you so much. Okay, there it is. timeanddates.com. Lovely. Okay, reset. And then, Dom, what do? I share screen and then I go to the timer. Correct? Like that? Oh, like I did the other day. I remember when I was doing that class. Can everybody see this? Hello, can we all see this?
We can all see it, Itu.
Thank you so
we can
much.
see it.
Okay.
You can see
Okay,
it.
well done. Well done for being able to see it. Well done. You guys are doing so well. Well done. Okay. Okay, Fola Shade, thank you. You can begin.
We have an issue with Russia and Ukraine intervening and interfering in US elections. We have an issue when the United States of America interferes with at least 85 countries' elections since 1945. Therefore, undeniably, a side proposition, we cannot have SADC, an organization that's supposed to deal with the relationships between countries, interfering in elections in any matter. And therefore, the stance we take as side proposition is that not only do we not value the intervention that of SADC, but we don't value interference of any organizations in any democratic elections at all, whether democratic elections at all, or any affairs. Right, so when we look at the word affairs, electoral affairs, we define this as any process of voting that has to do with all sectors of government, whether executive, legislative, or judicial. So this, the yardstick for our debate today is which side best respects and upholds sovereignty. And sovereignty is going to be a very important idea in today's debate. Therefore, we place the burden on side proposition, and we place the burden on side opposition to prove to us. Side opposition needs to prove to us, one, why they would value interference in elections to a point where sovereignty is lost, and the second burden being why they would value interference when it's absolutely likely to fail. So the criteria that we present to this debate is when we would believe interference in electoral affairs is necessary, and we simply believe that we don't value interference at all, and we, on any scale, we don't think that any organization or any country should be able to interfere in any electoral affairs, right? So the burden that we place on ourselves is we need to prove to you why we don't value interference as a whole, and why we value this idea of interference even if there are negatives to come to it, and why we believe that sovereignty as a whole is important to many countries, right? So when we look at SADC, we see that SADC is an organization that basically deals with the relationships between countries. SADC deals with trade agreements, and SADC has about 16 members. So we see that the first point, the point we're going to be presenting to you is that we believe that one, SADC or any interference will never act in the best interest of the said country that they want to be interfering in. Two, that there's never any reason to actually interfere. And the third point being sovereignty, right? So we're going to get into it. So on to my first point, which is why we see that SADC or any organization will never act in the best interest of the country. So if we look at a bit of characterization of SADC, we see that SADC has chairpersons, and many of the chairpersons, so basically the chairpersons are presidents of the said countries, the 16 countries, and it's on a rotating scale. So the person isn't actually elected, it's on a rotating scale, making sure that the power is equally distributed, but we see that is not true. So we see that the main objectives of SADC, and I quote, is to achieve economic development and peace. And we see that economic development and peace is not achieved through electoral intervention. We see that intervening or trying to interfere with these elections will not achieve that. We see that the chairpersons of these states, right now it could be Namibia, next will be President Ramaphosa, we see that undeniably undeniably the power dynamics in SADC are not the same. If we look at South Africa, we see that South Africa has most of the power distribution, and we see that South Africa holds a lot of power. If we look at a scale, we see that since a very long time ago until coming into the future, South Africa will always have more power than other countries. Therefore, we see that different countries have different abilities and different countries have different resources. Therefore, there will never be enough power distribution in order for an interference to be fair, right? We also see that out of the 15 countries in SADC, only one of them is a female. So we see that these positions in SADC, they're not held by female leaders. So therefore, their interests and the interference in these countries will always be coming from a male perspective, a male straight perspective. And therefore, we see that SADC as a whole can never interfere in a country. And we believe that no matter what is going on in the country, we don't believe that it is morally okay or morally permissible for SADC to interfere in any country's election. I'll take you in a minute. That is why, as side proposition, we don't value this intervention, because we see that the intervention will never be in the best interest of the country. Taken. Yes, Taken?
What kind of intervention are you guys talking about? Can you give examples? Oh, yeah.
Right, so we look at interference. Political interference or electoral interference can be any way from propaganda, right? Sending out pamphlets or on social media saying, okay, vote for so-and-so. We see that interference comes in various states and various examples. Interference can literally be propaganda, or it can be blocking certain people's ability to campaign to all areas, or making sure that certain voting stations aren't available in all areas, therefore changing the results. And we believe that this interference is so great that we cannot allow it, and we cannot allow it in any way. We also see, moving on to my second point, it will never be legitimate. Because we see that in order for interference to occur, we see that all members of SADC, all countries, will actually have to vote, and they will see one problem. So all members of SADC, I'm giving you an example, will have to say, okay, we're going to interfere in Zimbabwe's elections.
POI.
So all these countries not taken they're going to have to vote on it. It will not be Zimbabwe going to South Africa and saying, hey, we have a problem with how Namibia is currently the people that are currently running for election, and we have a problem. No, all members of the state are going to have to interfere. And now if we look at SADC as a whole, SADC on no basis, SADC doesn't take charge in voting. SADC has no grounds to actually interfere in elections. That is not what they have to do. So we see that even if they had the grounds, or even if they were able to, we see that it's that in no way do we value this intervention, because we see that SADC focuses on the agreement between states. SADC doesn't focus on the problems and the conflicts going on in individual countries. They focus on the marriage and making sure countries not taken. All countries are actually going on. We see that if SADC has intervened, and we give you examples such as when SADC tried to intervene in Zimbabwe and Angola, it wasn't successful. So we see that intervention in itself will never be successful. You will have not taken, you will have different countries trying to interfere in one country, and there will always be backlash. Me as Zimbabwe, I'll be angry, okay, these 15 other countries told me there's something wrong with me. So what will happen is we see there's discourse in these countries. So therefore we don't ever value interference at all. We can see that it's never morally permissible to try and take away this idea of sovereignty. And we're side proposition, we value this idea of sovereignty, and that's why, as my second speaker will elaborate further, we see that in order that SADC has no grounds to do this, and that is why we place the burden on you as side opposition to prove to us why you would value intervention or interference when we know it's likely to fail, because we've shown how it's likely to fail. So as side proposition, we stand on the grounds that we don't value intervention from SADC, and we don't value interference at all, and we'll never value interference on any electoral issues, because as an organization, they can't tell a country what they think is beneficial for said country. And that is why we stand by what we said. We don't value interference, and we never will value interference. And because of this, we strongly propose this motion.
Thank you. Just a sec. There's something really interesting here. Okay. Okay.
Yeah,
Kifli, can you hear me?
yes, I can. Can you
That's
guys
okay,
hear me?
test, okay. Yeah, your opposition first, correct?
Yeah, that is correct. Yeah.
Okay, ready when you are. You can see the time on the screen, hey?
Yeah.
Thank you, boy. Okay, you may begin.
If you believe in a democracy that aims to actually empower people's voices, then you should vote for side opposition. But before I move on with my speech, I would like to begin with some rebuttal. Now, Proposition Speaker 1 comes up here and tells us that, the USA, Russia, they have before intervened, in numerous elections, in numerous electoral affairs that have happened in other nations. But what they fail to understand is that in this instance, we're not talking about a singular nation in particular like the US or Russia, interfering in another country's electoral affairs, but we're rather talking about an organization, a body that is actually neutral, an external body that is neutral, that aims to, help achieve, this political fairness throughout its member states. So we cannot provide, you cannot give a comparative example of countries like the US or or Russia, because, these countries is just one particular country. However, the SADC is a neutral organization. It is something that is external, and, it's not directly pegged to only one country. Side proposition also comes up here and tells us that, even if this interfering does occur, it doesn't necessarily help, achieve economy and peace. But we think this is very false, because we've seen that in numerous examples and in numerous occasions when elections don't go out well and don't go out as planned, when violence breaks out, when there's civil unrest, we often know that, the peace is disturbed in a country. So obviously, if the SADC decide to interfere in such elections and provide peace in these nations, they are, automatically providing peace within these member states of the SADC. Furthermore, we also think that there is a major contradiction that happens in Proposition Speaker 1's speech. She comes up here and tells us that the problem with the SADC is that there is only one country. There's only one president. There's one chairman who is often the president of a country that is the chairman of the SADC, and that in itself doesn't make the SADC a balanced organization. That in itself makes it biased. However, in her same speech, she comes up here and tells us that in the SADC, no matter what decision they're supposed to make, they still need every country's vote. So how is it that this organization is balanced? Is imbalanced and is only centralized to one person and one country, yet they need everyone else's votes, to make any further action. Now, for today's debate, I'm going to give a definition and describe exactly what this sort of interference that we're talking about is going to look like, and in what instances we believe as side opposition it is, morally and legally correct to interfere in countries' elections. My second speaker is going to talk about how this contributes to the democracy in a region and how this can lead to the economic stability of these member states, which are part of the SADC. And thirdly, the third speaker is going to identify some clashes, rebut, and provide any clarification if need be. And there are three things we're going to prove to you in today's debate. Firstly, we're going to prove how in the past interference of an external neutral body has actually helped a country's elections. Secondly, we're going to prove to you why it is necessary to allow the SADC to be able to interfere when need be, according to the circumstances and the situations that I'm going to further mention in the speech. And thirdly, how this sort of interference will help achieve better democracy. Now, we understand that the SADC is a socio-economic corporation as well as a political and security corporation. So obviously, if we ask ourselves why the SADC, we have to answer simply by saying that this is an organization that has the direct interest in the political affairs that are happening in the member states. And since they have the political and the moral obligation, to engage and interfere in these people's elections, you see, when member states become a part of the SADC, they already automatically, waive some of their sovereignty to this regional, to this even bigger corporation. Now, what do we exactly mean by when we say, interfere? Now, the SADC already has an observation mission, and they already have an electoral advisory council, which side our proposition fails to understand. They come up here and tell us that the SADC has, part of the SADC's job is to never involve themselves in any sort of electoral affairs that are happening in the member states. But this is not true at all, because they already have an electoral advisory council, which already sort of has a mission to observe and oversee these electoral affairs that are happening in the member states. Now, when do we think is it necessary for us to interfere in these elections? Firstly, we think that it is necessary when these elections are leading to civil unrest and any form of violence that, inherently harm the citizens of that country. Secondly, we think that it is necessary to interfere, when we think that there are unfair practices in the elections. And we think these can come up in three ways: either when there's intimidation or suppression of the people of that country, when there's electoral fraud, which includes vote rigging, and when there's when the media access is very limited, when there's a form of biasness that is occurring in the media. And thirdly, we think that we should also intervene or interfere in a country's elections when the member states don't uphold the autonomy and the independence of the electoral management bodies. Now, the problem with status quo is that, a lot of these electoral management bodies, they're said to be autonomous and completely independent of the government. However, the chairman of that body is usually elected by the president himself. That in itself doesn't make these, bodies autonomous and independent. They already make them biased. And that's why sometimes we think that it is necessary for an external neutral body
Point of information.
to be to interests of another country. And the fourth reason is we think that it is necessary to interfere when the countries do not adhere to the international electoral standards. And those include transparency, they include the legal campaign mechanisms, and they include ballot access for political parties and candidates. Now, side proposition tells us that why should we opt for an interference even if we think that it is going to fail? This is very false, because we have seen in the past that the UN did interfere, in elections in Sudan, and that has led to a better and a more politically unified country now. So they cannot tell us that this is something that is not practical or something that that cannot necessarily work. Now, when we talk about the type of interference, we think that this highly depends on the situation at hand. I mean, if there is political violence and if there's violence and if there's civil unrest, we think that this is when we can deploy things like measures like peacekeeping troops. And we think that if there is a form of electoral fraud or when the, let's say, decides not to give in and not surrender his power, we think that we can provide sanctions, which are like financial penalties, as well as trade barriers. And side proposition can't come up here and tell us that countries aren't ought to listen to or aren't forced or legally obligated to listen to what the SADC have to say, because this is entirely false. If we take an example of Zimbabwe, a country that is landlocked, a country that needs South Africa, Mozambique, or Tanzania for import, of a lot of their trade. We think that countries like these, we think that there is no country that is, powerful enough to say that they do not need the SADC and, they're above the SADC in terms of the penalties and the sanctions or the trade barriers that they can face. I would like to provide a very simple case study, ladies and gentlemen. Zimbabwe had the president, Robert Mugabe, who clung to power for almost 40 years of his lifetime. In 2007, this president swore that only God is the one that is going to take him off of power. This is when he lost the elections in 2007, and he was finally removed by the military. Now, if we ask ourselves, if there was a form of interference in elections like these, elections that aren't fair, elections that aren't just, in countries like Zimbabwe, don't we believe that we will provide a much more politically unified and a much more peaceful nation, and also provide peace in general in SADC? A question that we need to ask ourselves, ladies and gentlemen, is: do we want another Robert Mugabe, or do we want peace? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Kifli. There you go. Lovely. Farai, can you hear me?
Yeah. I can hear you, yes.
Okay, perfect. I can hear you as well. Just a second. Okay. Ready when you are.
All right, thank you. Panel, we find it extremely concerning when a board of wealthy, powerful men from different countries have more control over a country's elections than the actual disadvantaged citizens of that country who are looking for positive change from their elections. We find it problematic when, let's say, the presidents of Zimbabwe and Namibia hold more power during elections than the 56% of people in South Africa below the poverty line looking for political representation from their elections. Today in my speech, I'll be talking about how allowing SADC to interfere in the electoral affairs of member states will cause a loss of sovereignty in member states. But first, some rebuttal. So side opposition comes to us with this idea that SADC has the right to interfere in the election process, and that's what they're meant to do. That's what their job is. But we say that's totally not true, right? Interfering in the electoral process is literally changing or doing something that may change the outcome of that electoral process, and side opposition hasn't taken that into consideration, right? SADC is not supposed to be here to change the outcome of elections. SADC is only supposed to be there to help like trade relations and economic development and peace between the countries, right? They also came with the idea that SADC is neutral, and as my first speaker already stated, no, they are not, right? SADC is comprised of a board of people from different countries. As my first speaker already mentioned, the power dynamic is totally unfair, and countries like South Africa have a lot more power than others, right? They also came to us with this idea, not taken, that if countries don't adhere to SADC standards, that they should be they should interfere in those elections. And we say that this is not true at all, right? You need to remember that SADC are invited to these elections, right? But they don't have to have, the country has to actively invite them to their elections, right? They don't have to interfere if they don't adhere by SADC standards, because as I mentioned before, it's not SADC's job to do so, right? And the first speaker of side opposition ended off his speech by saying, we don't want another Robert Mugabe, we want peace, right? May I remind you that SADC is the very organization that made Robert Mugabe chairman of SADC for 3 whole years, right? And we see this as somewhat problematic, right? Now onto my positive matter, right? And my thesis for this, my positive matter will be how allowing SADC to interfere with electoral affairs of member states will cause a loss of sovereignty, right? POI. I'll be answering 3 questions in my speech. Why SADC contradicts sovereignty, why sovereignty should be upheld in elections specifically, and how SADC is detrimental to democracy in a sovereign context. But first we need to understand what sovereignty is, right? Sovereignty is the authority a state has to govern itself, also in elections, right? If we take the example of a sovereign state is a state that has a defined territory and administers its own government and is not subject to or dependent on another power. And a non-sovereign state is the exact opposite. An example of a non-sovereign state would be the United Kingdom, right? When we look at a sovereign state, we see that 16 out of 16 of the countries involved in SADC are sovereign states. So we see that they do value sovereignty, right? But why is sovereignty important in this debate in the first place? To answer this question, we need to look at the purpose of elections, right? The purpose of elections is for the population to be able to choose who they want in power for themselves, right? And second of all, is to create a form of a representative democracy, right? What democracy looks like is a whole country coming together to vote a leader in power, right? That represents the masses and represents what a country wants to achieve, right? This looks like Namibia's political system, showcasing a free political system in which leaders put in power the citizens that they want, with a great respect for civil liberties, right? So it all boils down to, in simple terms, power to the people, right? Giving the power to the people who are directly affected by the outcomes of these elections to determine how they go. Why? Because they are the people who are actually affected by these elections. If you are having a democratic election, it is supposed to be contained to those people in that country. Why? They are the ones affected, not some president from Zimbabwe, right? And so we say that sovereignty is not only a country's leader having the authority or power to conduct elections however they see fit. Sovereignty is also people of that country having control over their own country's political future, right? SADC has the power to interfere with elections, regardless of how good their judgment is, and regardless of their readers' their reasoning, SADC's interference destroys the whole fundamental purpose of elections themselves, right? It contradicts what it means for a state to have complete power over their own political elections, right? I'll take it.
POI?
Yes.
Yeah. Do you believe that the SADC is currently interfering in or has interfered in any electoral affairs happening in the member states?
Yes, they have, but not successfully, right? So sovereignty looks like so what does sovereignty look like in an African context? Because this is what this debate is about, right? Sovereignty looks like the African fight against colonialism based on preserving sovereignty, right? Sovereignty looks like Tanzania being termed as a governance state, completely shaped by agencies such as World Bank and IMF, and the fight against this. Why? We value Tanzania having control over Tanzania, right? So why not put these same values in our electoral spheres if we hold them so highly in every other aspect of like of like the African standard political system, right? If we fought for sovereignty for this long, why cut it off? Why put it in every other aspect except for in our elections? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Farai, for that. Just a minute quickly, and Nadia. There you go. Nadia, girl, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Are you ready? I'm ready when you are.
Okay.
Okay.
It has become a culture in Africa in general and in the SADC region in particular that while in the world democracy is measured among others by elections, they have ceased to be a credible feature. Some states in the SADC region are known for timely and consistent elections that are, however, illegitimate and often characterized by violence and abuse of human rights. This House believes that SADC should interfere in electoral affairs only in some instances, such as like how the first speaker said. But first, I'll start with some rebuttals. The proposition side has came up with the main argument of sovereignty. Let me tell you what sovereignty means. Sovereignty means that it is the will of the citizens to live under the government that they want to, the government that they have chosen. So as we talk about SADC interfering, SADC will only interfere in instances where they feel as if the sovereignty of the citizens is being compromised by a group of people that are in the election process. When the election is unfair, when people are rigging the ballots, when people are rigging the votes, that is when SADC interferes. Again, you also talked about how there's a group of people, only certain people are sitting there in the SADC offices while they're disadvantaged citizens that are actually there in the country where the elections are being held. But you're forgetting that these presidents are chosen by those disadvantaged citizens. Presidents in Africa are chosen by a majority of people, whereby in this majority, there are also disadvantaged citizens. So the presidents are there taking this, yeah, sorry?
Are you taking my point?
Yeah.
Will you change policy, or are you willing to change policies such as like homosexuality and how countries deal with that, determined by how SADC views these issues?
Cases like homosexuality, of course, they'd have to go through discussions in the country themselves. And if the citizens are okay with it, then that's okay. But if the citizens are not okay with such cases, and then the government just passes it without the citizens' approval, then yes, SADC should intervene. Okay, moving onward, I'm going to go to my arguments. So first of all, like the first speaker said, intervening in instances where elections fail to be free and fair has the following outcomes. For my first argument, I'm going to talk about how it will contribute to democracy in the southern region. Because among the basic democratic principles is a free and fair election. SADC's intervention will not only promote free and fair elections, but it will also further other democratic principles like citizen participation, accountability, and transparency. A lot of citizens do not take part in election affairs right now because they do not feel like their voice is being held, because they feel as if these elections are unfair. They view these elections as it is just like an exterior, making it look as if yes, there's democracy in a particular country, but actually there's actually rigging, there's the rigging of the votes, there's intimidation, so citizens do not participate. But if SADC intervenes in these elections and allows citizens to be able to participate in these elections, it makes sure that the elections are being held fairly, it monitors, it observes, it sanctions countries that are not holding their elections according to their democratic principles, it will further it. It will also further accountability and transparency, because when SADC intervenes, corrupt and illegitimate leaders will have to be held accountable for their illegitimacy in the campaigns, and their illegitimacy in the election process, and interfering in things like the electoral body that is concerned with the election processes. Also, it will also promote transparency in the government, because the leaders that will then be held, the leaders that will then be chosen after this, SADC's intervention will be leaders that have already been put under a certain microscope. These leaders will have no choice but to be transparent with their dealings, because they have been a result of intervention because of previous undemocratic practices. SADC's intervention will result into member states being under governments that are regarded credible by the state itself and the region as a whole. All of this matters because democracy will help bring political stability in the country. It will reduce the abuse of power that is being done by a lot of leaders, and will ensure good governance, something that has been of a little extent in the southern region. Take, for example, Mugabe. He issued a decree ending any legal challenges to the results of a parliamentary ballot that was marred by violence, intimidation, and rigging, and SADC didn't interfere. This was an election that was done, and then the president was like, no, do not, just do not take it to the court or anything, it will go on with this. So because of this, the violence, intimidation, and rigging that happened, SADC could not stop it. It continued an undemocratic rule in Zimbabwe. As we all know, Zimbabwe has been one of the worst governed countries in Africa. Again, I'm moving on to my next point. SADC's intervention will lead to economic stability. When the election process is tampered with and an illegitimate leader comes into power, most, if not all the time, these leaders are more focused on building their own wealth and their supporters' wealth and their families' wealth at the expense of the state. They use the state's income to boost their own personal interest. But when SADC interferes and ensures that a free election is held, citizens are given a chance to choose a leader that they believe will go there with sound policies, that will go with guided policies, that will go with responsive policies that are fair to them, that are fair to the community, that are fair to the economy of the country. And eventually, when the policies are actually good policies, policies that will be able to boost the economy, because SADC has interfered, SADC has been able to make sure that the citizens choose a good leader, then obviously the economic capability of the country will be stabilized. It also matters because the southern region consists of developing countries whose economies are crawling. Therefore, the relationship between the politics of a country and its economy should not be ignored. Politics of a country have a direct effect on the economy. If the politics of a country are unfair, if the election process is unfair, then eventually we will choose leaders that are only there for their personal interests, that are only there for feeling responsible to fill their own pockets instead of developing the country themselves. Also, take an example of Dos Santos. He was 70% of Angola lives on less than $2 a day. In his rule, the Angolan parliament made it illegal for the president to have financial holdings. He then began arranging for his daughter to receive financial kickbacks and becoming one of the richest women in Africa. This is all because of the failure of SADC to properly intervene in instances where democracy is not being upheld in these countries, in instances where citizens are not being able to choose the leaders that they really want, because presidents do things such as changing the constitution so that they can remain in power, because of influencing the electoral committees, which are supposed to be independent. So SADC's intervention is really important in making sure that democracy is upheld, which is something that is very important. It will also, when democracy is upheld in one country, if we leave one country in the SADC community, if we let it go on with unfair elections, it will eventually lead to undemocratic practices that will spread out to the rest of the countries in SADC. Do we really want to ignore undemocratic practices and just let them be and pretend as if we're not a community, as if SADC is not an integration, as if this bad effects are not going to go on to other countries in the SADC community. This is not only important for the country, the specific country and the citizens, it is important for the whole region as SADC advocates for a mutual beneficial community. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nadia. Ande, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, are you ready? Ready when you are.
Sorry. Panel, let me remind you that South Africa actually voted Jacob Zuma in, right? What the nuance is in this example is that an election doesn't necessarily, or a fair election doesn't necessarily mean that the leader will automatically be this like savior leader, this amazing leader who doesn't participate in any corruption, right? What I'm saying though is that necessarily then side opposition doesn't achieve what they want. They never tell us or never explain what their election or what this fair election will actually mean for leadership realistically, right? We think all their aims are just like unrealistic and are just in the best cases or best scenarios. So this is where we find ourselves when we start today's debates. We think that when we were considering this motion, we ought to ask three main core questions, right? Firstly, is interference ever legitimate? Secondly, when an external institution intervenes in a country, whose interests are they acting in? And then thirdly, does SADC actually have the mandate or like principal foundation to actually intervene, right? We think both functionally, we need to understand how SADC works, right? So ultimately then, what was our yardstick in this debate? We think ultimately we were trying to debate which side, or we were trying to prove which side best respects a country's sovereignty, in the sense that we're looking at how do we best protect the needs and the wants of an individual country, right? And this is, and side proposition gives you our case in three burdens. We want to prove to you that interference is not the best is never done in the best interest, especially when it's done by organizations such as SADC. More than that, we want to prove to you that SADC is not equipped to actually lead these interferences, and this equipment is like morally. And then thirdly, we want to prove to you that sovereignty should be upheld in all circumstances, right? What we burden opt to prove, and what we don't think they ever actually do, is that we need them to prove why, when it's guaranteed to fail, why we must still intervene, right? It's like a principal question of why this intervention is actually necessary, principally, and we don't think we ever get that engagement, right? So then on this debate, what we ultimately what we ultimately had is three clashes. Firstly, what is interference and what does it actually look like? Secondly, how does SADC actually enforce its rule in the case of this interference? And thirdly, what are we actually trying to achieve by the end of this debate? Before I get onto these clashes, I think we ought to look at the strategic mistakes from side opposition. Our first mistake that we have, the mistake that we have in their case, is that they assume that, or they don't actually tell us why democracy ought to be upheld, right? We think a lot of their case is contingent on the fact that we actually want to achieve democracy. I'll respond to this more in our clashes, but like quickly my response would then be, is that we don't, like countries have, will always act in the best interest of their own country. We think countries should be able to choose what type of states they are and how they govern. We don't think that you can actually rule out authoritarian regimes, and I'll analyze that more in a clash. The second we get from their case is that, like I already mention this, is that like voting, if you vote then everything will be good, essentially. What they tell us is that a fair election will lead to their ideals of democracy. It will lead to economic stabilization because all these leaders will be just. We don't think they give us enough on that. So on the first clash on what is this interference, or what does it look like, right? Essentially, what side opposition tells us is that this interference happens when like there's to calm civil unrest, number one, when there's a media bias in like elections, and thirdly, when the elections don't achieve the international standards of what an election should be, right? We don't actually understand what they actually characterize as a country or like an organization interfering, right? What we told you from side proposition from the beginning, Sade told you that when SADC interferes, it's not like a pretty little thing of them trying to do something. It happens in many different ways. It happens with them either spreading propaganda or influencing media attention, right? It happens in military intervention. Why do we think this clash is important, right? We think this clash is important when you understand how gross this intervention actually is, right? When we understand how involved this intervention requires SADC to be. We think that's important because we don't actually think SADC needs to be this involved in the internal affairs of a country, right?
Yeah.
Understanding what this contextualization actually looks like, we think this clash falls to us because we really like look at what this intervention actually looks like. Before I continue on to the second clash, I'll take a POI.
Do you believe that when there is an unfair leader, SADC should just sit back?
Right, so we don't think like unfair leaders are in the position they are for no reason, right? We think we're willing to defend authoritarian states because sometimes they actually do work, because sometimes these authoritarian leaders are willing to work in the interest of their country. We give you an example of Singapore, like it's literally has one of the best GDPs, economic growth, and like best human development index in the world, right? But we recognize that it is actually an authoritarian state. We don't think that example is exclusive to Singapore and it can be applied in this debate. Now onto the second clash on how SADC actually enforces its rule, right? Under this, we asked two questions, right? We asked firstly, what is their actual mandate? And secondly, when will SADC actually interfere? So what is their mandate? We think opposition grossly miscontextualizes this because we think SADC actually only interferes in things when it relates to how countries relate or interact with each other, right? SADC doesn't actually interfere in the internal affairs or internal policies of a country. When I asked the POI if they're willing to engage in changing like gay rights or policies on the LGBT community, what I'm essentially asking though is how far their stance will go in interference, right? We think that they don't tell us, or they don't just tell us why this mandate should ever change for SADC and why is there a real necessity to change such a mandate. Then on the second question, right, when will SADC interfere? Side opposition tells us that SADC will interfere when the people of a country want them to. Why do we think this is wrong? We think SADC inherently as an organization will always act in the interest of the organization and not its people. We think that when Sade tells you that there's power imbalances in SADC, it's important to recognize because those power imbalances influence how the organization reacts to things, how it enforces its rule, right? What does this mean in this debate then? Ultimately, it means that when we understand how SADC interferes, we don't think we'll actually ever get the change, or we don't think we'll get the interference that they claim to have, this good interference that doesn't look like gross military intervention that is actually useless, right? So with these clashes then, what do we think? We think that ultimately we've won this debate because we actually have a real contextualization of what SADC does. More than that, we think that we show you that there's no legitimate grounds for SADC to ever interfere, and this is why we...
Thank you, Ande, thank you, ma'am. Okay. Saloha Said. Can you hear me, ma'am?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Are you ready? Ready when you are, hey.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, the problem of this debate is the current electoral system that African members of states have. which makes a country's sovereignty be at stake at the first place. So what SADC opposition have been advocating for in this entire debate is they just want respect for sovereignty, but they're not looking at the other side where these sovereignties at the first place are at stake. Another thing SADC opposition failed to ignore in this debate, ladies and gentlemen, SADC's responsibility, one of the main responsibility is peace and security. So the only system that can provide peace and security during elections, in most of these corrupted elections that have been going on in African state, is SADC. And they did not tell us whatsoever any kind of system they did not tell us any kind of system that will remove all the problems that we have in this current system that we currently have. They came us and told us the problems that biasness, propaganda, and all other problems, but they did not tell us a system that can solve that problem. And we tell you the problem is in the current system that we actually have right now. So, first of all, in my speech, I'll prove to you three main clashes. Which system act for the best interest of the people? My second clash, which system has the moral obligation to interfere? And my third clash is sovereignty will still exist within both sides. So to begin with the first clash, they came up here and say that SADC will not act at the best interest of its people. So they do not have value to these countries. Ladies and gentlemen, SADC is an organization that have responsibilities such as to promote peace and security within a country, to promote economical stability, political stability, and all other things. So, and they do not, it's not only one country, as you guys have mentioned, example of one country influencing the other country or intervening with the other country. It's a group of organizations that are going to make a final decision that will affect a country's election in a good way. And we also told you that when it's necessary for these countries to intervene, well, I'll prove to you in my second clash. So the first speaker came up here and said that SADC is run by the chairperson. I believe that is very irrelevant to this debate because at the end of the day, the final decision is being made by the entire community and not one member state at first. And then they came up here and said that when SADC interfere, they won't have any kind of economic stability. Ladies at the first place, and we believe that SADC, when interferes in elections, we believe that the citizens will select appropriate leader who will lead the countries to economic stability, which was proven to my second speaker by my second speaker. And then they said that power distribution won't be equal. Ladies and gentlemen, these dictators who have been leading these countries have been taking up all the power and all the wealth of the country, and that is when power is not equal. But you did not tell us whatsoever what kind of power South Africa has in this SADC community. You just tell us that power is not equal within this community. Another thing they came up and talked about that countries will be interfering with other countries. And we're going to tell you that it's not countries interfering with other countries. It's SADC as a whole, who is a neutral body with responsibilities that will benefit all the states fairly. And also another thing, they contradicted themselves. They came up here and say that SADC's responsibility is to provide peace and security. And we told you that SADC's responsibility, that's why they're morally obligated to interfere in these elections when it's necessary. That is, like in cases where there's violence, unfair practice, suppression, biasness happening. That's when we believe that SADC has a moral obligation to interfere in the first place. So they came up here and talked about propaganda, media biasness, and all that. Ladies and gentlemen, I have one question. What solution did SADC proposition provide to solve the problem that you guys are advocating for? You did not answer the burden of proof at all. Your burden of proof was to tell us that the reason why SADC should not interfere, and you have to tell us a solution that will solve the current problem that we have in hand, which is the current system that we have. We believe that the current system are being influenced by these leaders. So that's why most of the time during the elections, the votes do not go, the votes are being system that monitors elections is being influenced by these leaders. So hence at the end of the day, the elections are not fair. Corruption is still happening and leaders are not held accountable. So we believe that SADC is the organization that will provide peace and security in these situations. We told you that it leads to economic stability. We told you that illegitimate leaders when they come to power, they're going to take away all the wealth of the country. And we believe that SADC will be there to stop it. The main contradiction of this debate is that you guys fail to understand that the problem that we have in this debate is that the system that we currently have is very unfair, is very biased, and most of the elections are being tampered, and people are not getting the leader that they want. That's the current problem that we have in today. And did not come up with any system on trying to solve it. But we really believe that SADC has the moral obligation because they have the best interest of these people. So in the second clash, which they came in their second argument, they told us that there's no reason. They told us there's no reason, but they not give us why there's no reason, because SADC is not responsible. And we told you SADC is responsible because it thinks about the economic development of all member states, the growth of these states, the peace and security, and also it has an electoral body that govern these. It has an electoral body that makes sure that these elections take place properly. And that's what kind of intervention we're talking about. I'll take your POI.
Okay, right. So throughout your case, basically, you as an opposition has assumed that all interference in elections will be for a positive. Interference doesn't have to be if something's going on. It could be South Africa and Angola deciding that they don't want Mugabe to be president. You need to understand that interference is always going to be
Point of information taken. What you just mentioned is South Africa and South Africa interfering in Angola, and not SADC as a community with all the member states interfering in Angola. That's what we're advocating for, ladies and gentlemen. So their third argument was sovereignty. Ladies and gentlemen, sovereignty is what still are going to elect the leader. It's not like SADC is the one who's electing their leader. People still at the end of the day are going to elect their leader. And then the whip say that, the whip say that SADC does not interfere in policies. At the end of the day, SADC does not have control in these elections. It's the country itself has the control of the election. We're just saying that the interference that we are talking about is that when SADC, the interference that we're talking about is when SADC makes sure that the political elections runs fairly, properly. When there's violence, they're going to provide peace and security. When there's unfair practice, they're going to make sure it's correct. When there's suppression within these people, they're going to make sure it's correct. When the leader is doing bad stuff to the country, they're going to be sanctioned. But what we are advocating for, but they're saying that they want sovereignty. You want you want respect for sovereignty. But the sovereignty at the first place is at risk. But how? At the same time, we believe that the country is going to still have control over the election. It's not like they're taking over the election, we're going to do this and that during elections. At the end of the day, the citizens are still going to select their leaders, the leaders that they want to. So ladies and gentlemen, in this debate, they told us their first argument that it's not of the best interest. We told you that it is of their best interest because it will lead to economic stability and and it will promote democracy, whereby leaders they're good leaders. And their second argument, they told us there's no reason for SADC to interfere. We told you that it's a moral obligation for SADC to interfere because it is their responsibility.
Thank you, Saloha. Thank you, Saloha. Right. Okay. Dul, are you doing reply?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm doing it. Yeah.
Are you ready? Ready when you are.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hello?
I can hear you.
Yeah, I'm saying, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay, cool. Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, I think the key problem, or maybe the key question that we should ask ourselves in today's debate is, what is this interference that we're talking about? Because side proposition comes and describes this interference in a way that SADC now have the right to change the results. They now have the right to put who they want into power in these member states. And this is not the interference that we're advocating for as side opposition. This is not the interference that we're describing. And then when we tell them that we think that it is fair and it is all right for us to interfere in certain instances whereby this leads to political to violence or civil unrest, or when we think that the electoral standards aren't met by a country, they say no, it's still not in SADC's it's not their right to also just interfere in these elections. Now, what they fail to understand is that from the very first speech, from my very first speech that I mentioned, is that what is this interference going to look like? Now, we told them that this interference doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to put someone in power and, you know, put the views of the people aside. No, that is not the interference that we're advocating for. When we talk about interference of the SADC, we mean that, like, when we think that, you know, there is something unfair that is going on in the elections, when the people's voices aren't actually being heard, we think that, you know, the SADC has the right to tell a certain country, which is a member state of the SADC, to sort of maybe hold a re-election, and if they fail to do so, hold things like economic sanctions or even form trade barriers, you know, for these countries. So when they say that the interference that we're talking about is completely changing the results of the elections and, you know, not considering the views of the people, we think that that is very false. You see, ladies and gentlemen, a key question that I'm going to ask at the end of today's debate is, which side better achieves democracy and actually cares about its people? Now, what does side proposition say? Firstly, what we get from side proposition is that they're saying that we shouldn't support something if it is ought to fail. Now, we think this is very false, because from my very first speech, I did mention how in the past, when a neutral external body interferes in elections, in certain instances where we think that, you know, the people's voices aren't being heard, we think that it is just. And when situations like that have occurred, you know, the UN has done that before and it did work. So when they tell us that, you know, something like this is ought to fail, something like this shouldn't be supported because it is going to ultimately fail, we think that this is completely false. And for them to draw, you know, a comparative example with a country like the US is also just, US isn't like a unified body consisting of a number of countries in a particular continent. Another thing that they say is that this doesn't necessarily help the country economically. We think that this is very false, because we, as side opposition, we believe that, you know, political instability, you know, directly, obviously, affects a country's economy. So obviously, if the country has some form of political stability and the people's voices are being heard, this, you know, in turn, you know, provides, you know, a better economy for that country. Another thing that they say is that the SADC has no right to involve themselves in practices which are inside another country, which we think that this is completely false. Because firstly, when a country is already a part of the SADC, they already have to waive off some of their sovereignty, you know, to this bigger corporation. And this is actually already present, because the ex-president of Tanzania has already been sent by the SADC before to be able to go and observe, you know, the elections of another country. So for them to say that when you are a part of the SADC, you still have to be completely sovereign. No, we think that this is false. The fact that you are a part of the SADC, that means you have already waived off some of your sovereignty to this larger corporation. Now, when we ask ourselves which side better achieves democracy and cares about the people, clearly it falls on our side, because we think we support the people. As side proposition already came up here and mentioned, they say that they are ready to support an authoritarian government. They're ready to support a government, you know, like Zimbabwe, someone who clung into power for 40 years, and give an example of Singapore. No, in Zimbabwe, there's hyperinflation, you know, and they're ready to tell us that it is okay for someone like Mugabe to still lead a country, even though the people of its country are suffering. And they still come up here and try and convince us that.
Thank you, Dol Kifli. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Nice one, thank you. Shade? You ready?
Yes.
Okay.
So panel,
watching. Yeah. Okay. So you may begin.
Okay. So panel, what you need to realize when adjudicating this debate is, as side proposition, our case had two levels to it. We said we don't value the interference of individual countries, and then the second part, we don't value the intervention of SADC or any organization. What we said, and the line we took, was we don't value interference at all, and that is something that we see the side opposition hasn't truly realized. Right, so we got asked a POI and they asked us, what does our interference look like? And we showed you what our interference looked like. Later on, we get a third speaker that says, well, that's not the interference we're talking about. So throughout this debate, we had come to agreement with the interference interference, that as side proposition, that is what we were talking about. But later we see that side opposition hasn't been able to stick to one line of what they want. What does their interference look like, and what is it characterized as? So what we see is side opposition wasn't able to truly decide what they wanted. Okay, so we look at the clashes in this debate. We saw the clashes was, when does an organization have the right to interfere, and why is interference valuable in any certain stance? And we see a side proposition, we want this. So our main burden was we needed to prove to you why we don't value interference. And the burden that we placed on side opposition, which one, they never decided to not take, they decided to burden themselves with the burden we placed on them, was why they value interference, even if it's guaranteed to fail. So we saw a lot of, yeah, but like some countries, maybe some countries, but we never saw the actual countries that actually worked. We see that they haven't been able to take the hard line and stand for what they stand for. As side proposition, we've done that. We've shown you why, above all, we value no interference, why we don't value it as a whole. We also see that they, the type of interference that they've spoken about isn't what in this debate we've adhered to. We see that they keep on flip-flopping and deciding what they want to say. We didn't get any engagement on my second speaker's point on this idea of sovereignty, and on my first point on how these people that are in the governing body of SADC make these decisions. What you need to understand, and what my second speaker said, which we didn't get any engagement on, was, listen, these people in power, they're voting on it. So the same corrupt leaders that you want to take out of power, these corrupt leaders are literally voting on this. And we said this in the beginning, how we'll never get engagement because SADC will never work in the best interest of the country they're interfering. And we really didn't get this. So as side proposition, what we've shown to you, that we said above all why we will never value interference. Right, I'll show you why we never value interference. One, we said we'll never value interference when it doesn't act in the best interest of our country, which we'll never get through SADC. And two, we can't value interference because it's a loss of sovereignty. Right, so to the sovereignty point, we get a side opposition that says, yes, but us as a side proposition, we don't value democracy. And we've never said that we value democracy in the first place. We value all types of governments. So yes, we value authoritarian governments, we value democratic governments, and in no point, our case was never about democracy and giving the people the opportunity to vote. Our policy and our idea, the case we presented, is trying to remain as a sovereign state where the country has the ability to do what they want. We don't believe that SADC as an organization has the right to completely to go in and change what a country does, because it's a governing body. So we see a side opposition, what they failed to do in this debate was take a hard stance. We see that they tried to make the case simple and easier for them than saying, oh yeah, interference, you know, when someone when the votes are bad or when there's a problem. But like we said, interference is when SADC as a body says we're going to interfere in these elections. So we don't want Mugabe, we want so and so. That is what interference is. Interference isn't only when something is bad, and in no way has side opposition ever told us how it's positive. What one country deems as positive isn't what the other country deems as positive. That's why we don't value interference, because we don't think as a body that SADC can ever control and ever dictate what its members should look like. That is why, as side proposition, we won this debate, because not only have we proved our burden why we will never value interference, we have also shown and debated in the most spirit of this debate, and that is why we won this debate.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Let me do this. Stop share. Right, and let me do that. Hi, everyone. Okay. Do you guys enjoy that debate? Hey?
Lovely debate. I personally thought that was a very good debate.
Yeah. Can I get your mics on, please, guys?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay. Yeah, would you, okay, so I think just before we go off, do you guys want to have any, do you guys want to make any comments quickly, especially the people that were on the sidelines? I see Anna is there. I see Husseina is there. I see Ali Hussein is there. I see Eric Alex. I see